In this video, you're going to get introduced to the HTTP built-in module in Node.js. So the HTTP module is used to transfer data using the HTTP protocol, which stands for the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So this is the typical task of a web server, which you can now create using Node.js. So first of all, we will need to require this module using the require method. It's called HTTP. All right, so what we want to do in this session is to create a server using this HTTP module. So to create a server, you will need to use a method of HTTP called create server. So this method will take as a parameter a callback function. So this is the callback function which will be executed when a user makes a request to our server. So let's call it respond. And also let's store the output of the method inside a variable I'm going to call server. So this is our server. So now what we need to do is create a function response which will be executed when a user makes a request to our server. So this is for creating a server, and now we need to create the callback. So our function is going to be called respond. So this function will take a couple of parameters, a request and a response. So you can call them anything you like. You can call them rec and res, but just for clarity, I'm going to call them request and response. So the request variable is something that the server is going to receive when the user makes a request to the server. So it includes various bits of information like the URL submitted by the user and so on. Now the response is another object which comes with so many methods which you can use to build a response which you will send back to the user. So for now, let's just write something really simple and just console.log the request variable. Okay, so if you run this code like this, then it's not going to work because you are missing an extra step which is really important, which is to listen to the user requests. So to do this, you need to use a method of your server, which you just created, called listen. So this method will take a few parameters. So it's going to take a first parameter, the port. So the port is like an endpoint of communication. So there are many ports which should be available on your system, and you need to choose a port that is available on the system in question so that it works. So for example, we can choose a port 3000 in localhost. So let's write our connection settings here. So let's start with the port. I'm going to go for 3000. You can choose another port if you like. So again, so a port is an end point of communication. All right, and also you will need a host name. Now the host name is an optional parameter inside the listen method. I'm just gonna use it for now. So the host name is the IP which is associated with your device, okay, or with the device in question. So any device connected to a computer network has got its own IP. So IP, which is associated with any device connected to a computer network. So a computer network is like the World Wide Web. All right, so let's define our hostname variable. So I'm going to be using localhost in this example. So in this case, it should be 127.0.0.1. And this is for localhost. Now, if you run this example on your own server, then you need to use the correct IP of that server and use a port which is available on that server. Okay, so now let's move to the next parameter, and this time it's going to be a callback function. So this is the function which will be executed when you start listening to the server. So let's define it right here, and let's just log something to the console, like listening on port followed by the port number and host name followed by the host name that we chose. Okay, so I'm missing something right there. So let's save, and now let's run our app. So you can see the output of our callback function. So listening on port and host name. All right, so at the moment, we are listening to user requests. So let's send a request and see what we get. So to send a request, we're going to go to Chrome, then go to localhost :3000. So at the moment, the page is going to keep loading because we are not sending any response. But we are interested in the value of the request variable for now. And you can see it's a huge variable which contains so many bits of information. So what we can do, we can log some specific properties of the request variable. So for example, let's log the URL. So we need to restart the server. So let's stop it using Control-C, and then let's run the command again. And let's send a request this time. Okay, it's already sent. So let's send it again. And you can see that our URL is right there. And that's because we haven't specified anything after the port number. So if you try, for example, cars, then that's the URL you get. So the URL will refer to anything that you write following the port number. Okay, so now the page will keep loading and we don't get any response. So let's go back to our file and create a response which we will send back to the user. So first of all, we're going to start with response headers. So response headers, they contain various bits of information about the file sent by the server, like the content type, etc. All right. Now, there are methods which you can use to set headers, which are attached to the response object. So the first one we're going to be using is set header. So the syntax of set header is set header, header name, and value. So let's try, for example, the content type. And let's set that to just text, plain text. So this is the syntax for it. All right, now let's add another header, and this time we're going to use another method called writeHead. So this method will take the status code and then the headers inside an object. So the status code will tell us how the request went. So if you get a status code 200, this means that we get a successful response. 404, for example, is usually used to say that the page was not found or something like that. So let's try this. So let's send back a status code 200 for a successful response. And let's add a header. So I'm going to go again for a content type. And this time I'm going to set it to HTML, like this. Now, what happens if you set the same header using this method and that method? Well, writeHead is going to be given precedence in this case. But if the headers are different types, then they are just going to be merged. All right. So in our case, the content type is going to be set to this because we're going to give precedence to writeHead. All right. So now after this, we're going to start building the body of our response. So to do this, we're going to use response.write. So this one sends the body of the response. So this will allow us to show things on the web page. So we're going to be writing some HTML. So what you can do, you can go to a website like JSBin to get a template like that. Then let's use response.write with our template. Okay, so let's change content inside it. So for the title, I'm going to go for node, and inside the body, I'm going to add a paragraph. Node is fun. So instead of using the write method only once like that, I'm going to split this so that I can customize it later on. So I'm going to put the paragraph in a separate statement. Like that. And I'm going to put the end inside response.end instead of response.write. So response.end marks the end of the server response. So that should be the last statements that you use when building the response of the server. Okay. So let's try this and see what we get. So I'm going to restart the server. So we're missing a parenthesis right there. Okay, so let's try again. And here we go. We get our paragraph there. And if we check the source, we can see some valid HTML code. Now, you may have noticed that when we sent the first request, we had two URLs being printed there. So the first one, which corresponds to that one, and there is another one here, which is looking for something else. And this is your website icon. Basically, anytime you open a website, if you don't specify the icon or the website icon location, then by default, it's gonna look for the icon in this path. And this happens as well when you check the source of the website. It's going to look for the website icon again. All right. So if you want to avoid that, you can go back to the code and only print the request URL if that URL is different from favicon.ico. So now if you try again, then you will avoid getting two requests like that. Perfect. Now I suggest testing your server requests and responses using Postman. So if you haven't got Postman, you can always download it from getpostman.com. So what you can do, you can just paste the URL right there and use the get method and send the request like that. So this is the response. So that's the body of the response, and you can preview it if you like. And these are the headers. So we set the content type ourselves, and there are other headers which will be set for us. So this application is going to be very useful when doing testing later on. So in the next video, you're going to go through a quick challenge using the HTTP module.